In the late 1990s, there was a hot window of time where it was possible for you to be a presence on popular radio and also, at the same time, a ska band. Part of this is because the 90s pop radio charts were kind of drunk on money and would try literally anything once or twice, but in that space and time, there was seriously a moment when the pop charts could have songs on it from Real Big Fish, the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, Less Than Jake, and the Hippos. It was a moment. And in that moment, you could go into a Coorong bookstore and buy Christian ska music, like Bunch of Believers' It's a Ska, 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 Ska World. Here, let's check out this intro to their music video clip for Mission Trip to Mexico.
What are you all about?
Dude, he wants to know our mission statement.
Mission statement? Right, got it.
By mission statement, he means our Bob motto.
Our motto? I thought that was a bunch of Spanish boats.
Cool. And yes, you may be wondering, this is around when South Park was a popular source of moral panic because they might corrupt the youth into swears. As a band, Bunch of Believers they're the blandest possible step below fine. Their music is basically competent, unremarkable ska, which doesn't convey much emotionality, and is exactly as good as it sounds when you start it. If you've ever used a musical keyboard and pressed the demo button, this is the ska version of that. The song's lyrics are abysmal, a song about going to Mexico to explain to a majority Catholic country what Christianity, as if they don't know what about it, it's just the start of it. But it was their best foot forward. They had on the same album such banger hits as I Saw Pastor Dancing, I'm Gonna Wait, and Homeschool Girl, and those are all exactly as terrible as you think. The thing with these songs is that they're not just boring and expressing an ideology I despise, they're also just really unchallenging and simple. Lyrics follow the simplest rhyming scheme with the same energy as, oh, I'm telling thee and I'm here to say that eating vegetables is a-okay. I'm not going to play you any samples, because that's how copyright bots find you, but also because it sucks on toast. So, during the height of this movement of music, where ska bands were getting everywhere from Clueless to Digimon, when South Park was at what we thought was the apex of its power, this is what Christian Media Machine was able to put out and capitalize on it. This is an example of what I refer to as Christian replacement media. If you're not already familiar with this, there are book publishers, movie producers, a streaming network, a variety of stores and industries, many based out of megachurches, that exist to attempt to create a rival media conglomerate to worldly media. You may have heard some of them, with the most publicly visible one lately being the PureFlix channel's attempt to provide an alternative to Netflix, serving up Christian-safe media that's designed to work for as many different categories of Christian as have the money worth shaking out of them. Christian replacement media is typically extremely low quality and hackish. The books are written in an amateurish fashion, with plot points rarely thought out, mistakes left in, and often entire plot points are whoopsied away in a way that may remind you of a fanfic author who can't go back and edit earlier chapters because they're released now and revisions happen to other people. The music tends to be safe and unextraordinary, with the best of the best in the space managing the stratospheric escape to conventional easy listening radio, where they just quietly fade away or return to safer spaces they're used to. The movies are just pure crap, but it doesn't matter because they're serving a market who care more about their ideological bent than their quality as storytelling media. I have a personal theory that Christian replacement media is typically bad because the people who operate in those spaces are selected away from the things that make you good at making them. Empathy for audiences is useful for making good media that connects to other people, and a lot of these creators are much too mean-spirited to think about how other people feel. In order to learn technique and variety in your storytelling, you need to expose yourself to other stories, and when you start doing that, you start pulling away into those other spaces. Some people are in this space because they genuinely believe it, but quite a few are in it because they can't make it in the mainstream. They can't convince new people. What they can do is preach very hard to a choir and hope that the choir doesn't know better about how good the work is. Whatever it is, you can probably find an attempt at a Christian media version of it. Social media networks, dating apps, clothing lines, political candidates, music genres, and Yes, cryptocurrency front ends all have their special version of a Christian replacement. Now, that you know this is a rich, fulgent field of extremely stinky blooms, let's talk about when in the 1980s they tried to make a Christian replacement Dungeons and Dragons. Let's talk about Dragonraid. If you're not already familiar with this, back in the 1980s and reaching well into the 90s, there was a moral panic about the potential threat to our youths that was Dungeons and Dragons. The concern, which you've probably seen highlighted with things like movies and chick tracts, or maybe even the promotional materials of BADD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, is that D&D taught realistic demon summoning rituals and created a magical reality that could ensnare the minds of youths, literally, and it was turning them into witches. Actually. You're hearing this, and I already know you're thinking, they didn't really believe that. And I need you to understand, I'm not messing with you when I say they really, really did, and pretending they didn't lets these people off the hook. Into this space, where there was a popular craze that Christians wanted to demonize, someone stepped up to make a Christian alternative to Dungeons and Dragons. That someone was Dick Wolf. No, really. Not that one, though. What Dick Wolf made was Dragonraid, a game that tried to bring the role-playing fun of Dungeons & Dragons into the space of children's Bible study, and in the process made a game that successfully merged the worst elements of both. I'm not going to talk here about fun in the context of this game. For a start, it's a bit of a cheap shot to just stand here going, look at this game, I bet this isn't fun, because social games and tabletop games and creative games are often incredibly enjoyable, even if the game system itself is terribly designed, because you are with your friends, and you are imagining with them, and you are creating with them, and that is itself inherently fun. The capacity of TTRPGs to be good in spite of themselves is amazing. What I do want to do, though, is talk about Dragonraid as if it were a game to take seriously. Not a random bit of detritus from the 1980s where someone made a bad Dungeons and Dragons variant and I'm going to complain about it just because that's the model of how YouTube does these things. I instead want to talk about what I see this game doing and the ways it's doing it to achieve its end. All game systems are a kind of incentivizer. They're all about trying to convince you to do the things that complete the game in one way or another. So the question Dragonraid asks, when you look at it, is what does this game want you to want to do? And knowing that it's a 1980s era Dungeons & Dragons competitor product, what is it like? Well, if you know what TTRPGs of the time were like, you're not going to be surprised. There's a lot of conventional wisdom about how Dungeons & Dragons alike games were at that point, with things like being able to die in character creation, that now we would look at and go, well, that's obviously silly, but at the time was considered kind of typical and cutting edge. To some extent, it's also considered a control mechanism to keep things that would make a character unplayable from escaping into the world. When I talk about this game, I want to strike a difference between complexity and complication. Something complex has lots of nuanced interaction between its pieces. You can't just adjust one element of a complex design without seeing a lot of interacting pieces directly responding. A design that's complicated, on the other hand, has lots of components in it that may or may not relate to things. If your design needs you to memorize a lot of things and references tables regularly, it's probably complicated. If it requires you to do difficult math in your head to make a correct judgment, it's probably complex. This game is complicated. It's very much not complex. In fact, mechanically, it's about as complex as a fighting fantasy adventure game book. The scenarios presented to you are presented with a very simple binary A or B. Action, options, outcome. Good actions get rewards and bad actions get punished, even if the bad actions could easily be done for good reasons. It's not really like you're running through a narrative or existing in a world, as much as it is you are responding to questions posited to you by the adventure master. And we'll talk about that kind of language in a moment. First, I want to read to you this example of how the game explains its basic mechanic for trying to do things and then succeeding or failing at doing them. You are walking down a trail, and the adventure master says you hear a noise ahead of you. You want to try and determine what caused the noise, a chipmunk, a bear, or an orc. So the adventure master tells you that you need to make a success check using your listening ability of 7. He says the noise has a difficulty level of 4. The numbers across the top of the success grid represent difficulty levels. The number down the left side of the success grid represent your ability ratings. Run your finger along row 10 until you come to column 4. Notice that the number there is 45. Now, to see whether you recognize the noise or not, you roll the star lot twice. The first number rolled represents the 10s and the second represents the 1s. For example, suppose you roll a 4 and a 1. That gives you a total roll of 41. In order to win a success check, the number you roll must be equal to or greater than the number on the grid. In this example, 41 is less than 45, so you failed the listening check and do not know what made the noise on the path ahead. That is the game introducing its simplest mechanic to you that it wants you to use all the time. It requires you to get 2 values, your ability and the difficulty of the thing as presented by the adventure master. It wants you to then look that up on a cross-reference table. Then it wants you to make a dice roll that anyone familiar would recognize as a D100 roll, but the game explicitly reframes as a star lot roll and will not use the normal terminology people are used to. And again, we'll get to that. And in return, what you get out of that is an example of not knowing whether or not a chipmunk is ahead of you. So everything about this is the kind of example I would normally say is badly done. It presents the system correctly, but the system in question is very complicated, needlessly so, for the simplest task. It gives an example that requires a lot of specificity about the activity, cross-referencing a table. And then the actual narrative it presents isn't interesting or exciting. It's, did you hear a thing? No, you didn't hear a thing. All the potential mystery that you could be using to draw someone in is gone. This style of writing is, throughout the entire book, constant. It is all extremely turgid. Sentences and phrases sometimes repeat or reiterate ideas very closely. It's all very poorly edited. The diagrams are done in what I can best describe as word tables kind of thing. The sort of thing that I would have been very proud of getting away with doing when I was a child and I didn't have access to a DTP program, but now as an adult with access to those tools, I find embarrassing to look at. The combat system uses multiple different types of math depending upon the types of enemies you're facing, and the systems for engaging in this combat are both extremely simplistic and extremely tedious. So you don't have a lot of options for doing anything. You're kind of just rolling your dice and seeing if you live or die. But also, doing that rolling of the dice involves looking up the table each time, doing some addition and subtraction, and of course, working out where the monster batch lies. How do you deal with yourself and your opponents doing multiple attacks against one another? It's a system that doesn't give a lot of room for player complexity or player options, which is probably for the best because characters in Dragonraid are extremely simple. You do not have control over much of the character design in this game. There are no classes, there are no backgrounds, there are no options. Let me just give you an example. Creating a character opens with this paragraph. Creating a character has been made as simple as possible by the use of a Light Radar worksheet. This worksheet contains virtually all the information that you need. Use it as you create your character. I want you to hold on to the phrase, as simple as possible. because this is literally the next paragraph. All characters in Dragonraid have different attributes that stem from the fruit of the spirit listed in Galatians 5:22-23. You will find 9 character strengths listed in the upper left-hand corner of the Light Raider worksheet. In order to find a rating for any one of these, take the star lot and roll it. For example, suppose you get a 7. That means you have a love strength of 7. Suppose you roll the star lot again and get a 4. This will be your rating for joy. Follow the same procedure for the remaining character strengths, rolling the star lot once for each. Note, a roll of 0 on the star lot is a 10, not 0. After you have rolled for each one of the character strengths, add them together and divide the answer by 2. Disregard any remainders. The result is your physical vitality, which is a measure of how healthy you are. If your physical vitality is less than 19, your character is too weak to enter the Dragonlands. Begin again and create another character. Again, this is as simple as possible. Equipment is fixed, defenses are related to that fixed equipment. There aren't special items you can get in the rulebook as presented. This is not an adventure about going someplace and getting stuff. This isn't about existing in a world where you can incarnate objects and interface with them. So this is a game that has a very low sense of materiality because everything about you is determined by your character sheet, which is also determined by random rolls. Random rolls that can make you so bad, you might die before you ever get started. I've mentioned a couple of times that we'll get to that when talking about the specific language this game uses. Dragonraid is full of concepts that are simple and easily understood in existing game parlance, and if you exist in the space of TTRPGs, you will often not even need to explain them. Maybe a glossary entry at the very start of a book, and then you will move on from there. For example, rolling 2 d10s and using 1 as a 10s and 1 as a 1s is a d100. We know this. This is a standard piece of geek paraphernalia that you can buy for a couple of cents. But, instead, the game describes them as star lots and gives you the process of rolling them every time it wants you to understand them, because it needs you to not think of them as D100s. Similarly, it's an adventure master, not a dungeon master, and throughout the book, you're going to find more of these instances of individual things that we have existing ideas for being replaced by something a little weird. You know, you get experience points in a lot of game systems, almost all of them. In this one, you get maturity points. Part of this is to reinforce the ideology of the game, which is fine, that's a perfectly good thing to do, and I don't mind when players do it. But in this case, this is an example of encircling language. The language the game uses to describe its basic functionality is the language it's using to make sure that the only game you know how to play is this game. Language and play experience in Dragonraid is only useful for playing Dragonraid. While I'm giving this a kicking, I would like to point out there is at least one genuinely good idea in here, which I think should be taken and used in other kid-focused tabletop RPGs. In this game, it's possible to wind up with a drawback or a penalty on you, some form of, curse. And you can ignore that and just try and plow on regardless. But your friends can also take some time and talk with you and try and help you with your curse, and if they do, you get to make a chance to get rid of it. If they don't even try, however, the penalty will wind up spreading. This is a way that the game can have in it a drawback system that will hinder people in individual combats, but over time you'll learn there is no reason to ever let these things stick around. So after every fight, there is a play ritual with rules and with a operation in it where you get to take care of everyone. In some versions of Dungeons & Dragons, after a fight, everyone heals up and the questions are things like, how many hit points did you lose? Yeah, I'll give you this many back, yeah. But in this game, it's instead, alright, you're feeling down because that goblin bit you. Let's talk about your feelings and I will try to exhort you in Christ to change the way you're feeling. Again, ideologically, I don't like that. But as a game designer, that notion of making downtime between encounters into a different kind of encounter with an existing rule set seems to me to be a very good way to encourage players to indulge in the social play element. That's about all of the nice language I have for this game, though, because Everything else in this game is exceptionally dire. Still, if you know anything about Dragonraid, you might know about the spellcasting mechanic, and it would be remiss of me not to share that. This card in front of you is a word rune. For lack of a better term, this is a spell. This is something that you can cast while you're playing the game. To cast it, you have to say this Bible verse reference, then the Bible verse, and then say the reference again. And you have to do this from memory. It's not enough to read it off the card. You're not allowed to look at the card when you're doing it. Now, you might point out that, hang on, the card has the effect on it. How am I going to know if I need it? Well, that means that there's extra memorization to be done here. And yes, this is a game where memorizing Bible verses is part of the mechanics. It starts with simple verses, and then it gets longer and longer as you go. Verses are measured by their word length, which I think is just the most Protestant American way to view scripture, where verses are to be weighed based on the number of words they have, not the complexity or depth of anything in those words. So you can't be looking at the card when you want to use it. The card is going to have that verse on it, and you need to be able to show that you can do the verse from memory. So you have a spell book that you have to memorize, and you activate the spells in that by quoting Bible verses. So you quote the Bible verse, you open your spell book, you show the rune word you're trying to use, and then you get to find out if you remember how to use it correctly, or if you have uses of it left. There is a nice incentive system here as well, where the longer a verse is, the more powerful an effect it has. But once you start using verses of a certain length, shorter verses stop being available to you, which means that you are steadily pushed to keep learning more and more verses. Or, given the way this system works, you might just ignore it entirely and trust to the dice, because, these are not some well-chosen verses. Now, if you're a Catholic or ex-Catholic and you're hearing this, you might be going, hang on a second. That's catechism. And I think you'd be right. Catechism is a process that some Catholics engage in, where you are expected to learn a sort of call and response sequence with the priest. That it's mostly a sequence of memorization, and the memorization is meant to make you more likely to keep those words in mind when you live your life. Protestants tend to speak very ill of catechism, because catechism is a Catholic thing, and then they tend to just come up with some weird conspiracy theories. This tries to make memorizing Bible verses and having an effect with them into a kind of catechism that you engage with for play, which is a bold strategy, and I don't think it's going to work out. Along with this, I do have a sample adventure, which I've read a little of. I haven't played it. It opens with toppling a idol held by a bunch of savages on a remote island who do know about God, but they're choosing to worship something else instead. And it then moves on to dealing with a goblin keep, where if, for example, you decide to leave the goblins alone, you are punished for being willing to let evil fester. Dragonraid's worldview is exactly what you would expect if I told you that it was written by a mean-spirited Christian in the 80s. The problem is the version I'm looking at is actually the 1998 revision, and the module is a 2008 release. This is kind of running in spot and mostly just replicating the same problem. But here's the big twist of Dragonraid. There already was a Dungeons & Dragons for Christians made by Christians. It was called Dungeons & Dragons. Something that often escapes the notice of people in this space is that Gary Gygax was a Jehovah's Witness. He was intermittent about it, and that's not uncommon, but he still door-knocked and gave out pamphlets, and a lot of his Christian beliefs showed up in his work. His game has things like clerics and holy water, priests and empowerment by God, while he made up fanciful pantheons, almost every single god who wasn't a lore-focused good god was some kind of scum some of the time, or incompetent the rest of the time. His games believed in punishing players for vice behavior. The adventures are often about destroying pagan idols from savage tribes, defeating dragons, and returning home. You will be given arbitrary advice from capricious strangers, and you need to be able to mind-read the module writer to tell if it's good or bad advice. And as far as leaving goblins alone being a problem, there is an old phrase from racist writers, which is "Nits make lice." It was a phrase used to justify the extermination of Native American populations. It was a phrase used to justify assaults against young Mormons. It is a phrase that Gary Gygax used when describing why you should be okay with murdering goblin children. Gary Gygax's D&D reflects his Christian ideology very thoroughly, and it is only in the most superficial ways that one could look at it and see it as anything but a Christian game made by a Christian man in a Christian landscape. It didn't work, by the way. Dragonraid's attempt to be Christian D&D. Dragonraid, which was a fundamentalist Christian alternative to Dungeons & Dragons, was criticized by the same moral panic-mongers who never played it. It was condemned for having evil content, and the same false claims about D&D were imposed onto it, which sort of shows you that it's never about the thing, is it? It's about what complaining about the thing lets you control. This is how moral panics work. Some people make a loud noise about something that isn't a problem because other people pay for loud noises, and it gives you power, and you never have to worry about people checking if what you say is true or not, because you're busy selling loud noises. And the rights for Dragonraid were transferred to a new business owner in 2018, and they have been trying to produce new modules since then. No word on if they're planning on updating the rule system to make it more in line with modern TTRPGs, but who knows, maybe we'll be seeing a Blades in the Dark hack for fundamentalist Christians.